When you were a kid, if your mother said, clean your room to my standards, if they are not to my standards, not only will you be in trouble, but I'll also take your bed away, what would you do? This is the government's policy on how we teach our children. Our public school testing program, implemented by the No Child Left Behind Act, is designed not to expand creative minds and evoke the natural curiosity of children, but to drain these kids with studying and test prep for weeks at a time. Third graders are studying for tests that they are taking the SAT for graduation. The 2001 Bush administration wanted every child to perform at 100% or place sanctions on schools. Why do we put such pressure on our children? In 2008 in Atlanta, Georgia, more than 170 teachers were caught changing the answers or handing out answer sheets to their students. They did this to increase the number of students passing the standardized testing so they wouldn't lose their funding. The teachers were told to raise the scores using any means necessary because their jobs were on the line. Instead of threatening our teachers with job loss or losing funding, we should be helping the schools that are already floundering and test scores and loss of attendance. The fact that educators saw cheating as a way for their school to receive the funding it deserved is not only disgraceful, but it's humiliating for the whole country. They're not just cheating the system, they're cheating the children. Finland is a very socialist economy, granting free education, including college, to their citizens, and no grades are given to students until they are in eighth grade. Compared to the US, where we have privatized for-profit schools, and my son was receiving a pass-fail grade at 6 years old in kindergarten. The Program for International Assessment, or PISA, takes a survey of 15-year-olds from 30 to 40 countries every 3 years. They then compare them to each other and rank the countries accordingly. In 2000, the United States was ranked 18th. By 2003, the US was ranked 24. From there, we spiraled in a downward trend. By the year 2009, we had dropped to the 31st. The 2015 results were released last October, and we had climbed our way back to the 24th position. While the news of gaining ground is worthy of celebration, our country, which boasts itself as the breeder of the best and the brightest in the world, has a lot of work to do to show that is true. 1.1 trillion, that is the U.S. spending budget for 2015. 54% of that budget, or $598.5 billion, went to military spending this year. Only $70 billion, or 6% of the total budget, went to the education in our country. This is the same amount as we paid for the entire government to run this last year. Our country spends over $500 billion on defense, but every time we have budget cuts, education is the first to go on the chopping block, even though our government continues to demand a 100% success rate. From 2002 to 2008, the cost of states to run this intense level of testing rose from $423 million to $1.1 billion. This is a 160% increase in state costs. With that much funding to schools, we shouldn't have dropped in world ranking, but dominated the top. China has been the #1 in education ranking, and although they have double the budget, they are still spending the most on education at $300 billion, and their military budget ranks last with only $145 billion. The U.S. spends 4 times the amount on military, and China is the next biggest competition for military growth. In 2006, the Department of Education's press release stated No Child Left Behind Act was working, and students had reached all-time highs in math, reading, and science. According to the 2011 Department of Education press release, states were allocating more money to the schools with higher success, thus widening the poverty gap between schools and school districts. These numbers are a discrepancy in which children were advancing. The money was being spent on advanced placement or gifted classrooms instead of the already struggling children. Again, this led to an even bigger gap between students instead of bringing them all together. In 2010, the Gates Foundation advisor and University of Washington professor Marguerite Rosa did an in-depth research on where the money for schools go, and found educational leaders were put money in opposite places that they publicly declared they needed to go, such as math, reading, history, and science, but instead put money towards electives, extracurricular activities, and sports. Once again, broadening the gap between the already achieving and excelling and leaving behind those students that are lagging, doing the exact opposite the No Child Left Behind Act was put in place to prevent. Before we moved up here, I knew plenty of teachers and would discuss with them at my son's football practice about which schools were paying more. Maintaining seniority was the most important than educating their children. These women would tell me directly that they didn't want to work in the low-income schools because they didn't receive enough funding to pay for the wages that they felt they deserved after so many years. The fresh out of college teachers low on the totem pole would have to take these high-poverty children as if they were a burden and work until they had enough years to move to a better school. The first time I heard this, I wanted to scream at these women that these children were not pawns in your financial game. After reading about Rosa's investigation into school funding, this is apparently common practice around our country. While throwing money at a problem doesn't seem to fix it, it could certainly be more regulated and dispersed accordingly. Allocating money to the high poverty schools would be more enticing to those veteran teachers, and even the playing ground for education. As of 2010, Our government now offers a watered-down version of the high school diploma. 2 of my siblings have this lower credited high school diploma. If your state requires 22 credits to graduate, they have the ability to change the rule on a case-by-case basis and let those with 20 credits graduate instead. It has become so challenging to get students to pass the test that we actually changed the policy to get more kids to graduate on time. I graduated in 2004. At the time, the WASL test, or Washington Assessment of Student Learning, was in a trial period and not required for graduation. I was a student who participated in after-school activities, director of multiple clubs, and active in many sports, all while maintaining a 3.5 GPA. I would not have graduated if the WASL had been a requirement that year. This is the kind of punishment we put our children through. We expect them to do well in school, want them to participate in clubs and sports while denying them the well-rounded education they deserve because we are focused on test scores. Title I schools are those listed as not having passed the testing criteria. They are supposed to be granted access to tutors and other assistants in classrooms. My son has attended multiple Title I schools, but because he was already in the gifted student classes, he did not qualify for the extra help. NCLB gave you the option to transfer schools when the school was failing every 4 years. Every year for 4 years, we had to change schools because the funding for the gifted students was constantly being moved from school to school. In order to maintain his level of education, he needed to follow those funds. My son didn't have a group of friends outside his league football club until 4th grade, and then due to a job relocation, a month into his 5th grade year, we moved again anyway. This led to problems with his confidence, that he couldn't make friends, and it also affects the school because they are already struggling, and now they're losing the funding for each student that leaves the school, and the school that is already succeeding is now getting that funding for attendance. After schools lose funding and are sanctioned for 6 years, they are then required to do a restructuring, and usually after firing the principal and spicing up the school, they would then see progress. According to an NPR report in October of this year, firing principals was the only success of No Child Left Behind. Why can't we reallocate some military funding for the Department of Education? Why can't we regulate which schools instead of which people are getting the money? And why can't we be number 1 in the world in education? Our citizens see themselves as the most innovative and ambitious people in the world. So why don't we put that pioneering to the test and give the schools the money and the propel our future leaders into the future with greater success, and stop thinking along the lines of test scores. Not everyone is good at testing, but that doesn't mean they don't have a place in this world.